So from our earlier discussions on terra nullius, we can look at this as being ethnocentric. That would be judging the standards of one culture by the standards in place in one's own culture. And we can see that notions of property here in the legal context, in terms of property ownership, this notion of terra nullius is a very ethnocentric approach to defining ownership as well as property as a whole. This has been challenged within Australia under the notion of Australian nationalism. And so you have the indigenous peoples of Australia, or what have been referred to as the Australian Aborigines. And in the Mabo decision, the legal notion of terra nullius was rejected. This led to a remaking of Australian nationalism, where both Australian and Aboriginal identities were incorporated in to this discussion of membership as part of the nationality as a whole. And we see the land claims for Aboriginals are still being complicated yet unresolved due to eligibility laws that require that populations demonstrate a historical connection of the group to the land itself. And this can be very much, of course, complicated where you have essentially a taking away of the land for long periods of time, movement into more urban areas, and then trying to go back and make the claim of populations of families that have potentially been removed for several generations from ancestral homelands. The notion of nationalism here ties into a larger discussion about naturalizing discourses. And naturalizing discourses would be the deliberate representation of particular identities, such as caste, class, race, ethnicity, and nation, as if they were the result of biology or nature, rather than history or culture, making them appear eternal and unchanging over time. And we, of course, see this not only in the context of Australian nationalism, but we also see this in the context of Sensio's work looking at Puerto Rican youth and their conceptualizations of how men should act and how women should act, and how they're classified by the same type of sexual behaviors. Williams notes that persuasive power is achieved by imaginary reproductions or conflation of particular identities, and notes that shared identity is connected to this idea of shared bodily substance and a sense of related culture. And so the shared body substance could be, we are members of this particular nationality, ethnicity, so therefore we have the same blood. More recently, we see conceptualizations along genetic explanations for this as well. Karst talks about this in terms of the shared hearth. So eating from the same hearth would indicate that individuals were members of the same family, essentially, the same substance overall. There's also this notion of essentialized identities, and these have been used sometimes very politically for a number of purposes, both by indigenous peoples themselves as well as those who are claiming to represent indigenous peoples or their interests overall. And the notion of essentializing identities is presenting group definition as descriptive of their essence, their distinctive spirituality. And so probably one of the most well-noted campaigns of this was the Crying Indian, who I believe was not Native American in ancestry, but was an Italian American, portraying a Native person who, seeing all of the pollution along the river and the highway and people throwing away trash, was crying because of all of the damage that was being done to the earth. So assuming that all Native peoples necessarily have this deep connection or appreciation of the natural world, as many potentially as many Westerners would define and think about the natural world. So within a legal context as well as a political context, you see the notion of strategic essentialism. And this is where essentialist rhetoric will be used as a conscious political strategy. In other words, Aboriginal activists would use this rhetoric, even if it does not always reflect their beliefs about Aboriginality. So in terms of doing things like preserving land base, there's an excellent article on transnational dams by Kirsch who talks about how the Adivasi of India were represented by discourses that circulated that the Adivasi can only have land, and if they have money, that they'll essentially just drink that money away. So the idea here is that politically it might be a very expedient strategy in the short term. However, it can create and reinforce and perpetuate stereotypes, which in the long run might be detrimental to indigenous sovereignty movements across the globe. Now, at its extreme here, we see nationalism can lead to violent conflict and violent extremism in a variety of contexts. Probably the most well-known of this, we talked a little bit about this earlier, the notion of eugenics and race science and biological anthropology supporting the notion of the supposed inherent superiority of one race over another. And these the eugenicists in both the U.S. and Europe, these ideas were picked up, and one of the results of this was the Holocaust as probably the most cited example. And we see here, of course, a deliberate attempt to so-called clean the population, to have it be supposedly racially superior population through cleansing. Some of the different forms of this would be ethnic cleansing, where you see selective killings or forced migration of a specific group of people. Ethnocide, with the destruction of a culture. Many scholars would point to the interactions between early United States and Native American peoples, particularly the targeting of large mammals, particularly buffalo, terrestrial animals, in order to target those things like hunting from trains and whatnot from the railroads, in order to deliberately undercut the economic and indeed spiritual, symbolic importance in the culture as a whole. We also see attempts at genocide, which would be the extermination of an entire people. And unfortunately, we will talk a little bit about these in this class as we go on in terms of war and violent conflict, as well as terrorism later in the semester. And again, much of what we talked about in not only this lecture, but the lectures on social complexity, economic anthropology, and political anthropology, as well as cultural relativism and ethnocentrism, these ideas will continue to come up through the course of the semester. Again, here, nation states are socially stratified, and that we see many of the categories that have been historically derived. Some of these have existed for very long periods of time: gender, class, caste. Others are more recent formations: race, ethnicity, and nationality. But as social constructs, these change over time, and they can be challenged by multiple individuals. And we'll see how these discourses about, and particularly naturalizing discourses about and essentializing identities, how this plays out in many of the political and economic debates that help to frame exactly how global problems are defined, and hence the solution to these global problems as a whole.